The wood of the pew was a cold, hard line against her spine, an unyielding truth in a room full of soft, cloying lies. Olivia sat, a statue carved from 80 years of silence, and watched the funeral of her mother. The church in Willow Creek, Montana, was just as she remembered it from a lifetime of Sundays. Stark, smelling of old hymnals and the faint, sweet decay of wilting lilies that flanked the polished casket. Eleanor was in that box. The thought came without emotion. A simple fact, like noting the dust motes dancing in the slanted afternoon light that cut through the stained glass depiction of a forgiving Christ. She did not cry. The wells had run dry decades ago, leaving behind only the cracked, barren earth of her soul. Her face, a roadmap of fine lines, was a mask of placid stoicism that the other mourners mistook for dignified grief. They came to her in a slow, shuffling procession, their hands soft and damp on her stooped shoulders, their voices dripping with a syrupy sympathy that turned to acid in her ears. "Oh, Olivia, your mother was a saint," whispered Mrs. Gable, her eyes wet with performative sorrow. "A pillar of this community. We were all so blessed to know her." A saint. Olivia felt a bitter, metallic taste at the back of her throat. She nodded, the movement small and stiff. What could she say? Could she tell them about the saint who wielded scripture like a whip? The pillar who had built a prison of piety and locked her inside. "She's with the Lord now, at peace," added Mr. Henderson, the butcher, his large hands clasped awkwardly in front of him. A long life lived in grace. Grace. The word was a mockery. Olivia's mind, a vault of carefully catalogued pains, offered up a single, echoing phrase. It was the key to every locked room, the answer to every unasked question, the ghost that had haunted every corner of her 80 years. It was Eleanor's voice, sharp and final, a divine judgment delivered with a human sneer. It was God's punishment. The phrase resonated in the hollow space of the church, louder than the organ's mournful drone. It was the soundtrack to her life. Punishment for what? For being young, for being hopeful, for being a victim. Eleanor had an answer for everything, and every answer was a condemnation that she had forced Olivia to wear like a shroud. A young woman from the congregation, someone Olivia didn't recognize, knelt before her. "Your mother saved my family," she said, her voice trembling with genuine adoration. "When my father lost his job, she brought us food every week. She prayed with us. She never asked for anything in return." She was an angel on earth. Olivia looked into the girl's earnest, tear-filled eyes and felt a wave of something akin to nausea. This was Eleanor's masterpiece, a public legacy of charity and light built upon a private foundation of absolute darkness. She had saved strangers while damning her own daughter. The cognitive dissonance was a physical weight, pressing down on Olivia's chest, making it hard to breathe the lily-choked air. She wanted to scream. She wanted to stand on the pew and howl the truth until the stained glass shattered. But she had learned her lesson over a lifetime of cold meals and colder shoulders. Silence was her penance, her cage, and her only shield. She offered the girl a faint, brittle smile. "Thank you," she managed, her voice a dry rasp. She was devout. The funeral was the inciting incident, the final, formal seal on a life of torment. Sitting there, surrounded by the monuments of her mother's public sainthood, Olivia was forced to confront the entirety of the lie. The casket was not just a box holding the body of a woman. It was a sarcophagus containing the stolen years of Olivia's life. The eulogy began, delivered by Pastor Michael, a man half her age who had only known Eleanor in her beatified final act. He spoke of her tireless work for the church, her unwavering faith, her boundless compassion. Each word of praise was a fresh lash against Olivia's spirit. Unwavering faith. Olivia's gaze drifted to the casket. She remembered Eleanor's faith not as a comfort, but as a weapon, a cold, hard instrument used to shape, to break, to control. It was the justification for every cruelty, the divine mandate for every act of psychological warfare waged within the four walls of their home. Boundless compassion. The memory of a slap, sharp and ringing in the silent aftermath of terror, rose unbidden. The memory of a locked door, of her own hysterical pleas, met with the stony silence of a mother who had already passed judgment. There was no compassion there. There was only a terrifying, cold-blooded pragmatism, a fanatic's need to preserve a perfect facade at any cost. The pastor's voice faded into a meaningless hum. Olivia felt a strange dislocation, the cold of the pew seeming to seep into her bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the Montana air and everything to do with memory. The scent of Mrs. Gable's cloying rose perfume mingled with the dusty lilies, and suddenly it wasn't an old woman's perfume anymore. It was the scent of rose water, the kind Eleanor used to splash on her wrists, the scent that always preceded an inspection, a judgment, a punishment. The cold of the wood deepened, and the church around her began to recede. The weight of 80 years dissolved, replaced by a different kind of pressure, the stifling, expectant silence of a house where God was always watching, and Mother was his chief informant. The polished wood of the pew became the dark, polished wood of the family dinner table. The mournful organ hymn faded, and in its place, she heard the relentless ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, each tick a second of her youth being stolen away. She was no longer 80, staring at her mother's coffin. She was 16, and she was trapped. The air in the house on Elm Street was thick enough to taste. It was a compound of lemon polish, old paper, and a heavy, unseen blanket of religious dogma. To an outsider, it was a home of impeccable order and quiet reverence. To 16-year-old Olivia, it was a cage, beautiful and suffocating, where the bars were made of scripture, and the warden was her mother. In this memory, Olivia was vibrant, a spark of color in a world of sepia tones. Her long hair was the color of autumn leaves, and her eyes held a restless, dreaming quality. She sat at her small desk in her bedroom, a sanctuary that was never truly private, a sketchbook open before her. Her pencil flew across the page, not capturing the dour landscapes of Willow Creek, but creating fantastical cities with soaring, impossible towers and vibrant, bustling streets. She drew faces of people laughing, their heads thrown back in joyous abandon, an expression she had never seen in this house. She dreamed of art school in a city far away, a place where the air wasn't heavy with judgment, where she could be more than just Deacon Jacob's dutiful daughter. The creak of a floorboard in the hall was her only warning. Olivia's hand froze. She quickly slid the sketchbook under a dry, approved text on theological history, just as the door opened without a knock. Eleanor stood in the doorway, a tall, severe woman whose thin lips were permanently set in a line of pious disapproval. Her presence seemed to suck the very light from the room. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her quiet scrutiny was more unnerving than any shout. Her eyes, pale and sharp, missed nothing. "Olivia, what are you doing?" The question was not one of curiosity, but of accusation. "My homework, Mother," Olivia said, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. Eleanor glided into the room, her movements silent and predatory. Her gaze fell upon the corner of the sketchbook peeking out from under the heavy book. With a flick of her wrist, she exposed it. She picked it up, her long, pale fingers holding it as if it were contaminated. She flipped through the pages, her expression hardening with each fantastical city, each laughing face. "Frivolous," she pronounced, the word landing like a stone. "Vanity. Building castles in the sky when you should be fortifying your spirit on the rock of the Lord." She stopped at a sketch of a boy from town, a gentle, clumsy drawing of him smiling. It was innocent, a mere daydream on paper. To Eleanor, it was a confession of sin. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "No one, Mother. Just a drawing." "Do not lie to me, Olivia. Lying is an open invitation to the devil." At that moment, her father, Jacob, appeared in the doorway behind Eleanor. He was the town deacon, a man respected for his quiet dignity and moral fortitude. His face was weathered, his hands calloused from his work as a carpenter, but in the church, he was a figure of gentle authority. At home, he was a ghost. He stood there now, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed somewhere over Olivia's head, refusing to meet her desperate, pleading eyes. His silence was not strength. It was an abdication, a form of complicity that felt heavier than any blow. He was the silent partner in her subjugation, his passivity giving Eleanor's fanaticism free rein. "We found this," Eleanor said to him, holding up the sketchbook as if it were evidence in a trial. She didn't need to elaborate. A single loaded glance was exchanged between them. Jacob gave a slow, somber nod, his face unreadable. He would not intervene. He never did. Eleanor turned back to Olivia. "There was a letter," she stated, not asked. "From the Miller boy. I found it in the bin. Did you think I wouldn't?" Olivia's face burned with shame and a hot, helpless anger. The letter had been a sweet, simple thing, asking if she might want to share a soda at the diner after school. It was the most normal, teenage thing in the world, and in this house, it was treated as a gateway to damnation. "Worldly desires are a snare, Olivia," Eleanor said, her voice softening into a tone of manipulative concern that was somehow more terrifying than her anger. "Your heart is a garden. If you allow weeds to grow, they will choke out the light of the Lord. These feelings," she gestured to the drawing with disgust, "are weeds. We must pull them out by the root." She closed the sketchbook. Olivia expected her to rip it up, to destroy the one place where she had any freedom, but Eleanor was more subtle than that. She tucked it under her arm. "You will spend this evening in prayer and contemplation," she said calmly. "You will ask for forgiveness for your vanity and for inviting temptation into your heart." She turned and left, Jacob melting away from the doorway with her, the two of them a united, impenetrable front. The door clicked shut, leaving Olivia in a silence that felt louder than a scream. She stared at the empty space on her desk, the sacred text on theology now feeling like a tombstone for her dreams. The unseen cage was solidifying around her. Every hope, every normal teenage impulse was pathologized, twisted into a sin that required penance. Her father's silence was the lock on the door, and her mother's piety was the key. She was trapped not by bars and chains, but by a love so twisted and controlling it felt like hate. She put her head in her hands, not crying, but feeling a spirit that was once so vibrant begin to fray at the edges, worn thin by the constant, suffocating pressure of their holiness. She didn't know it then, but this methodical breaking of her spirit was merely the prelude. It was the tilling of the soil for a seed of horror that was about to be planted, a horror that would be concealed by the very atmosphere of oppressive sanctity they had so carefully cultivated. The evening descended as Eleanor had commanded, a penance of silence and forced piety. Olivia knelt by her bed, the floorboards cold against her knees, mouthing prayers for sins she didn't believe she had committed. Outside, the sun set, casting long, lonely shadows across her small room. The house grew quiet, settling into its nightly rhythm of strained peace. Her father would be in his workshop in the barn, a small detached structure at the edge of their property. He often retreated there after dinner, ostensibly to work on church pews or repair furniture. But Olivia knew it was also his escape from Eleanor's intensity. He would sit there for hours, the scent of sawdust and his pipe tobacco hanging in the air. It was the one part of their property that felt distinctly his, a male space of wood and tools and quiet contemplation. Later, Eleanor came with a glass of milk and a single dry piece of toast. "The Lord appreciates a humble heart and a simple meal," she said, placing it on the nightstand. There was no warmth in her eyes, only the cool satisfaction of a warden checking on her prisoner. Olivia ate, the food tasteless in her mouth. She eventually climbed into bed, the sheets feeling cold and unwelcoming. Sleep did not come easily. The house was too quiet. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. It was the silence of a predator waiting. She tossed and turned, the confiscated sketchbook a phantom limb that ached with its absence. Finally, exhaustion began to claim her, pulling her down into a thin, restless sleep. She awoke to a sound, or maybe it was a feeling. The creak of a floorboard, different from the one her mother made. Heavier, slower, her eyes snapped open in the pitch-dark room. The air was cold, but a prickle of sweat traced its way down her spine. The door to her room, which she always closed, was slightly ajar, a darker rectangle against the dark of the hallway. She held her breath, listening. Nothing. Just the frantic pounding of her own heart. She told herself it was the wind. A dream. The house settling. Then, a shape blotted out the rectangle of the doorway. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She tried to scream, but her throat closed up, a knot of pure terror. A hand, large and rough, clamped over her mouth before any sound could escape. It pressed her back into the mattress, the force of it stealing the air from her lungs. The scream died in her throat, becoming a muffled, desperate whimper. Her memory of what happened next was never a clear narrative. It was a chaotic slideshow of sensory horrors, a collection of fragmented impressions that her mind would replay for the rest of her life, unable to assemble them into a coherent story, but never, ever able to forget the pieces. There was the smell. A thick, cloying mixture. The clean, earthy scent of sawdust, the kind that always clung to her father's work clothes. And beneath it, something else. The sweet, pungent, chillingly familiar aroma of her father's favorite pipe tobacco. The detail registered in some deep, terrified part of her brain, but it was a puzzle piece that didn't fit. It was an impossibility her 16-year-old mind couldn't begin to process, so it was filed away, a dissonant note in a symphony of fear. There was the fabric, the scratch of a heavy wool coat against the bare skin of her arms, rough, like burlap. It chafed her, leaving red marks. There was the weight, an oppressive, crushing weight that pinned her down, making it impossible to move, impossible to breathe. It was the weight of a nightmare made real. And there was the silence. The only sounds were her own muffled, frantic gasps for air behind the smothering hand and the grunting, labored breathing of the shape above her. No words were spoken. The attack was a thing of grim, silent violence. When it was over, the weight was gone. The hand was removed from her mouth. The shape retreated, a shadow melting back into the shadows of the house. The door creaked shut, plunging her back into absolute darkness. For a long time, Olivia didn't move. She lay there, tangled in her sheets, her body a geography of pain and violation. A profound, shaking cold settled deep in her bones. She was detached, floating somewhere above herself, looking down at the girl broken in the bed. Then the hysteria hit, a tidal wave of it. Sobs tore from her raw throat, ragged and uncontrollable. She scrambled out of the bed, stumbling through the darkness, her only thought a primal, childish need. Mother. She flung her own door open and ran down the hallway to her parents' room, bursting in without knocking. "Mother!" she cried, her voice a shredded wreck. "Mother, please!" The bedside lamp clicked on, flooding the room with a harsh, unforgiving light. Eleanor was sitting up in bed, her face a mask of sleep-creased irritation. Her father, Jacob, was a still lump under the covers beside her, unmoving. He didn't stir. Olivia stood there, trembling, wrapped in a thin nightgown, her hair a wild tangle. "Someone was in my room," she choked out, the words tumbling over each other. "A man. He hurt me." Eleanor's face, in that instant, transformed. It was not with shock, not with horror, not with sympathy. It hardened into something cold and terrifying. She got out of bed, her movement sharp and deliberate. She walked towards Olivia, her eyes scanning her daughter from head to toe, not with concern, but with a cold, appraising disgust. Olivia reached for her, desperate for an embrace, for comfort, for the safety only a mother could provide. Instead of comfort, Eleanor's hand flew up and struck her across the face. The slap was loud, a brutal crack in the silent room. Olivia's head snapped to the side, the sting of it a shocking physical punctuation to her psychological horror. "What did you do?" Eleanor hissed, her voice a low, venomous thing. "What did you do to invite this, to bring this filth into my house?" Olivia stared at her, uncomprehending. The pain of the slap was nothing compared to the agony of those words. "I didn't," she stammered. "I was sleeping." "Liar!" Eleanor's eyes were blazing with a righteous, fanatical fury. "Sin invites sin. Your vanity, your wicked thoughts, your letters to boys. You left the door open for the devil, and he came walking in." She grabbed Olivia by the arm, her grip like a vice, and dragged her from the room. She didn't take her to the police. She didn't call a doctor. She hauled her hysterical, traumatized daughter back to the scene of the crime, to her own bedroom, and shoved her inside. "You will stay in this room," Eleanor commanded, her voice void of all emotion except a chilling certainty. "You will get on your knees and you will pray to God for forgiveness for what your sinful nature has brought upon this family." With that, she pulled the door shut. Olivia heard the click of the lock. And then, silence. A silence that was infinitely more terrifying than the attack itself. She was alone, locked in with the ghost of what had just happened. The lie had been born. It wasn't her father, with his familiar scent of sawdust and pipe smoke. It couldn't be. Her mother, her saintly mother, had just told her the truth. It was a stranger she had invited through her own wickedness. It was God's punishment. And as she slid to the floor, her back against the locked door, the sobs racking her broken body, Olivia began, for the first time, to believe it. The sickness came not as a sudden wave, but as a slow, creeping tide, a foul bloom in the quiet waters of Olivia's body. It was a betrayal from within, an echo of the betrayal that had been forced upon her. In the dim light of the early morning, she would press a hand to her stomach, a gesture that was half dread, half interrogation. The world had gone tilted and strange. The scent of frying bacon from the kitchen, once a comforting signal of a new day, now sent her reeling. The heavy, floral perfume Eleanor favored clung to the air like a shroud, making her gorge rise. These were the secret signs, the clandestine messages her own body was sending her, confirming a truth too terrible to name. For weeks she lived in a haze of denial, a desperate prayer that this was merely an illness, a fleeting malady that would pass. But the tide did not recede. It rose, persistent and undeniable. The final damning evidence came not from a doctor's sterile office, such a public admission was unthinkable, but from the quiet, rhythmic failure of her own body to follow its familiar cycle. The absence was a presence, a deafening silence in the monthly rhythm of her life. And in that silence, terror bloomed, vibrant and absolute. She found the courage, or perhaps the desperation, to face her mother in the late afternoon, a time when the house was steeped in a drowsy golden light that seemed to mock the darkness in her soul. Eleanor was in the parlor, her Bible open on her lap, her lips moving in silent prayer. The air was thick with the scent of lemon polish and righteousness. "Mother," Olivia began, her voice a dry whisper. Eleanor did not look up immediately. She finished her verse, her finger tracing the delicate paper, before closing the book with a soft, final thud. "Yes, Olivia?" The words caught in Olivia's throat, a knot of shame and fear. She could only stand there swaying slightly, her hand instinctively going to her abdomen. Eleanor's eyes, sharp and discerning as a hawk's, followed the movement. A flicker of something cold and knowing passed through them. There was no surprise, no shock, only a grim, terrible confirmation. "It is as I feared," Eleanor said, her voice devoid of warmth, flat as a tombstone. "The wages of sin are death. But God, in his infinite and terrifying wisdom, has chosen a different path for your punishment, a living one." She stood, her tall, gaunt frame casting a long shadow that swallowed Olivia whole. This thing is your mark of shame, a brand upon your soul, a walking testament to God's wrath upon the defiant. You will carry it, and it will carry your sin for all to see. Olivia flinched as if struck. She had come seeking what? She didn't even know. Not comfort. She knew better than to expect that. Perhaps just an acknowledgement, a shared moment of horror. Instead, she was met with a verdict, delivered with the cold finality of a judge. She looked past her mother, toward the closed door of her father's study, a silent plea for an intervention that would never come. Later that evening, the family council convened. It was not a discussion. It was a sentencing. They sat around the heavy oak dining table, the same table where they shared their silent, joyless meals. Eleanor presided, her hands clasped tightly, her knuckles white. Jacob sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of stone. He painstakingly polished the silver candlesticks, his movements methodical and precise, his gaze fixed on the task. He refused to look at Olivia, to acknowledge her presence in the room. His silence was not an absence of opinion. It was an endorsement. It was the heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered any possibility of protest, any gasp for air. He was a pillar of the church, a deacon whose reputation was as polished and pristine as the silver in his hands. That reputation was the only thing that mattered. A child born to an unwed girl in this house would be a stain we could never wash away, Eleanor began, her voice low and conspiratorial, as if sharing a sacred strategy. It would be the end of your father's service to the Lord. The whispers, the shame. It would destroy everything we have built. Everything he has built. Olivia stared at her father, at his broad, stoic back. The man who had taught her to ride a bicycle, who had once read her stories with a rumbling, gentle voice, was now a stranger, a co-conspirator in the erasure of her life. He offered no defense, no flicker of paternal pity. He was complicit, a silent partner in the narrative his wife was weaving. Therefore, Eleanor continued, her eyes gleaming with a feverish, strategic light, we have decided. The Lord works in mysterious ways, and He has provided a path, a difficult but necessary one. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the suffocating silence. You will go away for a time, to visit a sick aunt. When you return, you will have a new baby brother. The words struck Olivia with the force of a physical blow. She gasped, a ragged, desperate sound. No. It is not a request, Olivia, Eleanor snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. It is a decree. This child, this vessel of your transgression, will be raised in this house as our son, your brother. It is the only way to contain the sin, to protect this family, to salvage your father's name from the filth you have brought upon us. Olivia looked from her mother's hard, resolute face to her father's unmoving back. He had finished the candlesticks. They gleamed in the dim light, perfect and untarnished. He set them down with a soft, final click. It was the sound of a door closing, a lock turning. She was trapped. A prisoner in her own home, in her own body. The choice was an illusion. Her identity as a mother, a fragile, terrifying, and nascent thing, was being stolen from her before it could even draw its first breath. She felt a hollowing out inside her, a vast, echoing emptiness where a future was supposed to be. She could not fight them. Their will was a fortress, and she was just a girl with a terrible secret. She gave a single jerking nod, a puppet whose strings had been pulled. The lie was cemented, and the foundation of her life, for the next 60 years, was laid in that cold, merciless room. The house on Willow Creek Lane became a different kind of prison. It had always been restrictive, governed by the ironclad doctrines of Eleanor's faith, but now it was a place of active, suffocating surveillance. Olivia's world shrank to the confines of its walls, her growing belly a secret that had to be hidden at all costs. Jacob, her father, became the chief warden of this silent prison. He moved through the house, not like a father, but like a ghost, a constant, unnerving presence whose silence was louder than any shout. From behind the curtain of her bedroom window, Olivia would watch him leave for his duties at the church. He would step out into the morning light, his suit perfectly pressed, his Bible held firmly in one hand. He would nod to neighbors, his expression a carefully crafted mask of pious benevolence. Mrs. Gable from across the street would wave, calling out, "A blessed morning to you, Deacon Miller," and Jacob would raise a hand in a gesture of serene acknowledgement. He was a pillar of the community, a righteous man, a source of guidance and strength. Olivia would watch this performance with a cold, hollow feeling in her chest. She saw the man they all saw, but she knew the ghost he became the moment he crossed his own threshold. At home, he was an expert in avoidance. He never touched her. If they passed in the narrow hallway, he would press himself against the wall, making himself smaller, as if physical proximity to her was a form of contamination. He rarely spoke to her directly, and when he did, his words were clipped, functional. "Eleanor needs you in the kitchen. The pastor is coming for dinner. See that the table is set." It was never, "How are you, Olivia?" There was never a glance, never a softening of his granite features. But he watched her. This was the most unnerving part of his silent torment. She would be sitting in the parlor, mending a tear in a tablecloth, her hands clumsy and slow, and she would feel the weight of his gaze. It was a physical sensation, like a pressure on the back of her neck. When she would risk a glance up, she'd catch him staring, his eyes filled with an intense, unreadable emotion. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't anger. It wasn't love. It was something else, something complex and dark that made her skin crawl. It was the look of a man surveying a problem he had created but refused to claim, a piece of broken machinery he didn't know how to fix, and so chose to ignore. The moment their eyes met, he would look away, his expression shuddering back into its usual stony blankness. The silent exchange was a form of psychological warfare, a constant reminder of her fallen state, his judgment hanging in the air between them, thick and unbreathable. One Saturday afternoon, the fragile peace of the house was broken by the sound of a child sobbing. Olivia looked up from the potatoes she was peeling to see little Sarah Gable, the neighbor's 6-year-old, standing at the back door, clutching a doll with a broken porcelain head. Tears streamed down her chubby cheeks. I dropped her, Sarah hiccuped. Her name is Lily, and she's broken forever. Eleanor, who was kneading dough with a fierce energy, merely clicked her tongue. Worldly attachments lead to sorrow, child. Go home to your mother. But Jacob, who had been reading the paper in the corner, set it down. He walked over to the door, his large frame softening in a way Olivia hadn't seen in months. He knelt, bringing himself down to the little girl's level. "Let me see now," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. It was the voice from her childhood, the one she thought was lost forever. It was a dagger to her heart. He took the broken doll from Sarah's trembling hands. "Ah, a clean break. This is not forever. This is fixable." He led the little girl into his workshop in the garage, a place Olivia was not allowed to enter. From the kitchen window, she watched him. He sat on his stool, his large calloused hands moving with an incredible, patient delicacy. He carefully applied glue to the porcelain fragments, his brow furrowed in concentration. He used tiny clamps to hold the head together, his movements as precise as a surgeon's. He spoke to Sarah in that same low, comforting tone, explaining what he was doing, assuring her that Lily would be as good as new. When he was finished, he wiped away a stray speck of glue with his thumb and handed the doll back to the girl. Her tear-streaked face broke into a radiant smile. "Thank you, Deacon Miller. You fixed her," she cried, hugging the doll tightly. "You are welcome, Sarah," Jacob said, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "Just be careful with her from now on." He walked her to the edge of the property, patting her head before turning back to the house. Olivia ducked away from the window, her heart pounding. The contrast was a violent, brutal thing. The hands that could so gently mend a stranger's broken toy were the same hands that remained clenched and cold to his own daughter. The voice that could soothe a crying child was the same voice that fell into a stony, damning silence in her presence. It was a calculated performance. He was capable of tenderness, of compassion, of fatherly care. He simply chose, with a deliberate and suffocating will, not to extend it to her. His silence was not passive neglect. It was an active, methodical stripping away of her worth, a daily reinforcement of Eleanor's venomous pronouncements. He was not just a silent father. He was the architect of the silence, and she was its sole, captive inhabitant. The birth was a clandestine, grim affair, conducted in the dead of night within the suffocating confines of Olivia's own bedroom. There was no hospital, no sterile comfort, only a grim-faced midwife named Agnes, a woman from a neighboring town sworn to secrecy by a hefty sum from Eleanor. The pain was a white-hot, blinding force, but the emotional agony was worse. Her father was absent, having sequestered himself in his study, the low murmur of the radio the only evidence of his presence. Her mother was there, but not as a comfort. Eleanor was an overseer, her lips a thin, hard line, her presence a constant, silent judgment. She offered no soothing words, no cool cloth for Olivia's brow. She simply watched, her expression one of grim duty, as if she were presiding over a necessary, unpleasant exorcism. And then, after an eternity of pain, he was there, a small, perfect creature, his cry a fragile, shocking sound in the funereal quiet of the house. The midwife cleaned him and wrapped him in a plain linen blanket. For one fleeting sacred moment, he was placed in Olivia's arms. She looked down at his face, at the tiny wrinkled features, the dusting of dark hair. An overwhelming, ferocious wave of love crashed over her, so powerful it stole her breath. It was a love so pure and absolute it felt like the only true thing in a world of lies. In that instant, she gave him his name, a secret she whispered against his downy head. A name she had chosen from a forbidden storybook. A name that meant hope. Samuel, she breathed, the word a prayer. The moment was shattered as quickly as it had begun. Eleanor stepped forward, her face a mask of stern purpose. "That is enough," she said, her voice crisp. "Give him to me." She scooped the baby from Olivia's arms, her movements efficient and devoid of sentiment. Olivia's arms felt suddenly, achingly empty. From that moment on, Samuel was no longer hers. Eleanor seized total and absolute control. She became the child's mother in every practical sense, his dictator in every spiritual one. She dictated his feeding schedule, declaring Olivia's milk tainted by sin and opting for a cloying formula. She dictated his sleep, his changing, his every waking and sleeping moment. The nursery, once Olivia's childhood room, was transformed into a Spartan chamber, stripped of any color or joy. Over his crib, Eleanor would stand for hours, not cooing, but reciting psalms of penitence, her voice a low, monotonous drone. "Behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me," she would murmur, the words a poison meant for both the child and the listening mother in the next room. She spoke constantly of cleansing the sin from him, of raising him in the harsh, unforgiving light of the Lord to counteract the darkness of his origins. Olivia, weak and hollowed out, was relegated to the role of a shadow, a ghost in her own son's life. But in that shadow, a fierce, desperate rebellion took root. Her love for Samuel was a secret fire that warmed her in the freezing landscape of her life. It was the one thing they could not take from her. She fought for small, stolen moments of genuine motherhood, slivers of light in the oppressive gloom. When Eleanor was at the weekly church bake sale, Olivia would creep into the nursery. The house would be silent, and she would stand over Samuel's crib, her heart aching with a love so profound it was a physical pain. She would not dare to pick him up, for fear of being caught, but she would hum the lullabies her own grandmother had sung to her, soft, sweet melodies that were a stark contrast to Eleanor's harsh psalms. She would watch the peaceful rhythm of his breathing, memorizing the shape of his mouth, the curve of his cheek. These were her sacred moments, her private worship. She would tell him stories in whispers, tales of brave knights and faraway stars, worlds where love was not a sin and mothers were not erased. She would hold his tiny hand, her fingers tracing the delicate lines on his palm, a touch that lasted only a moment too long but was charged with a lifetime of unspoken devotion. When she was tasked with mending his tiny clothes, she would press the soft fabric to her face, trying to inhale the sweet, milky scent of him, a scent that was hers and not hers. Her love for Samuel was a dangerous clandestine act. It was a burden of secrets and a wellspring of strength. It was the fierce, painful, and defiant heart of her existence, the only thing that kept her from shattering into a million pieces in the emotional prison of the house on Willow Creek Lane. She was a mother in hiding, and every stolen glance, every whispered song, every fleeting touch was an act of war against the lie that sought to consume them both. The years spooled out, measured not in birthdays and holidays, but in the slow, inexorable growth of the lie that defined their lives. Samuel grew from a baby into a boy, a bright, inquisitive child who knew the world only as it had been presented to him. In this world, Eleanor was his mother, a figure of stern authority and unpredictable discipline. Jacob was his father, a distant, silent man who offered him polite nods but no real warmth. And Olivia was his big sister, a source of secret comfort, quiet laughter, and an unwavering, gentle love that felt different from anything else in the cold, stark house. He loved her with the simple, fierce loyalty of a younger brother. He saw the world through a child's clear, unjaded eyes, and what he saw confused him. He saw the way his mother's face would harden whenever Olivia entered a room. He heard the constant stream of criticism, the sharp-edged rebukes for transgressions so minor they were almost invisible. Olivia had folded the napkins wrong. Olivia's humming was a distraction from prayer. Olivia had let a patch of dust gather on the mantelpiece. The punishments were always swift and severe, but Samuel noticed they were sharpest, most venomous, when they involved him. If Olivia read him a story from a book that wasn't the Bible, Eleanor would confiscate it, declaring it worldly trash. If Olivia laughed too loudly with him in the backyard, Eleanor would call them inside, her voice tight with a strange, cold fury. He couldn't understand it. Why was his mother, who demanded perfection and piety, so relentlessly cruel to the kindest person he knew? Olivia was his champion, his confidant. She was the one who would sneak him an extra cookie when Eleanor wasn't looking, who would draw him pictures of soaring dragons on scraps of paper, who would listen to his childish fears about monsters under the bed with a solemn seriousness that made him feel safe. The dynamic of the house was a puzzle he couldn't solve, a constant source of anger and unease that settled deep in his small chest. The turning point, the moment that cemented his allegiance and planted the seeds of a future rebellion, came on a sweltering afternoon in his 10th year. Olivia, using the small amount of money she had earned from mending clothes for a neighbor, had done something extraordinary. She had bought him a comic book. It was a brightly colored, thrilling adventure about a superhero who could fly, a forbidden treasure in their black and white world. They had huddled together in the shade of the old oak tree in the backyard, Olivia reading the words aloud in a dramatic whisper, Samuel's eyes wide with wonder. It was a perfect, stolen moment of joy. But such moments were never allowed to last. The back door creaked open, and Eleanor stood there, her silhouette a stark, menacing shape against the bright light, her eyes fixed on the comic book in Olivia's hands. "What is that filth?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the warm air like a shard of ice. Samuel instinctively tried to hide the comic behind his back, but it was too late. Eleanor strode toward them, her face a thunderous mask of rage. She snatched the comic from Olivia's grasp. "Worldly trash! Pictures of false idols and violence. Is this how you repay the shelter and food you are given? By poisoning this child's mind with garbage?" she shrieked, her voice rising with each word. "It was just a story, Mother," Olivia said, her voice trembling but steady. She had risen to her feet, placing herself slightly in front of Samuel. "Do not call me that in front of him," Eleanor hissed, her eyes blazing. "You corrupt everything you touch." "Leave her alone," Samuel burst out, his own voice small but fierce. He couldn't bear to see Olivia cower. "She's the only one who's ever nice to me." Eleanor's head whipped around, her fury now directed at him. "So the poison has already taken root. You defend the sinner. You choose her over the word of God." Her gaze flickered between the two of them, a cold, calculating look in her eyes. "Then you will share her penance. You will learn the cost of siding with corruption." The punishment was one of Eleanor's cruelest inventions. They were forced to kneel on a scattering of hard, uncooked rice in the dim, musty parlor, their backs straight, their hands clasped. Eleanor placed an open Bible before them. "You will recite the 119th Psalm until I am satisfied that you have contemplated your transgressions," she commanded before leaving them in the suffocating silence. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The sharp grains of rice dug into Olivia's knees, sending shooting pains up her legs. She began to recite the psalm in a low, broken monotone, her eyes fixed on a crack in the floorboards. Beside her, Samuel was silent, his small body rigid with defiance. Tears of pain and anger welled in his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. After a long while, he leaned slightly toward her, his shoulder just brushing hers. "I'm sorry, Liv," he whispered, his voice thick. Olivia turned her head, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her own cheek. She gave him a faint, watery smile. "Don't be. It was a good story, wasn't it?" A small, choked laugh escaped Samuel's lips. "Yeah," he whispered back. He could fly. In that shared moment of pain and quiet defiance, something profound shifted between them. The rice pressing into their knees was no longer just a punishment. It was a bond, forged in injustice. Samuel looked at Olivia, not as a sister who had gotten him into trouble, but as an ally, a fellow prisoner. He saw her pain, and he felt a fierce, protective surge that was older and deeper than brotherhood. The lie of their relationship had been built to separate them, to place Olivia in a position of shame and him in a position of judgment, but Eleanor's cruelty had backfired. It had fused them together, creating a loyalty so strong that one day it would be powerful enough to shatter the very foundation of lies upon which their lives were built. He didn't understand the truth, not yet, but he understood who his family was. It was the woman kneeling beside him on the hard, painful rice. The air in the room was a thick, stagnant tapestry, woven from threads of antiseptic, dying breath, and the cloying sweetness of wilting flowers. For decades, Olivia had imagined this moment, rehearsed it in the silent theater of her mind. She had pictured a storm, a final desperate confession torn from her father's lips, a whirlwind of truth that would either shatter her or set her free. But there was no storm. There was only this suffocating calm, the shallow, rattling tide of Jacob's breathing, and the oppressive presence of her mother, Eleanor, who stood like a marble sentinel by the window, her back a rigid monument to piety. Olivia sat in a hard-backed chair, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white stones. She watched the rise and fall of the thin blanket over her father's chest, a fragile rhythm that seemed to be measuring out the last seconds of a lifetime built on silence. He had been a phantom in her life, a man whose presence was defined by its absence. His silence had been a form of governance, a quiet, unassailable wall that reinforced every one of Eleanor's cruel edicts. He was the deacon, the righteous man, his quiet dignity a shield for the rot that festered within their home. And Olivia, for 64 years, had been the designated sacrifice upon the altar of his reputation. A flicker of movement. Jacob's eyes, milky with age and illness, found hers. A tremor went through his hand, a weak, palsied gesture. His voice was a dry rasp, the sound of dead leaves skittering across pavement. "Eleanor, leave us." Eleanor turned, her face a mask of practiced concern. "Jacob, dear, you need your rest. Olivia can come back later." Her voice was smooth, coated in the false honey she reserved for public consumption. It was the same voice that had soothed parishioners and condemned her own daughter in the same breath. "Now," Jacob rasped, a flicker of the old quiet authority stirring in the embers of his life. "Please." For a moment, Eleanor's mask tightened. A flash of something cold and possessive glinted in her eyes before being veiled once more by sorrowful obedience. She glided over to Olivia, her hand resting for a brief, proprietary second on her daughter's shoulder. The touch was like ice. "Don't tire him, Olivia." It was not a request. It was an order, a final assertion of her control. Then she was gone, the soft click of the door sealing the two of them in the stale, waiting air. Silence descended again, but it was different now. It was charged, expectant. This was it. The moment of reckoning. Olivia leaned forward, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. She was ready for the apology, the explanation, the confession that would finally name the demon that had haunted her since she was 16. She was ready for him to say, "It was me. I'm sorry." But Jacob's eyes weren't filled with guilt. They were filled with a desperate, frantic terror, a fear that was not for himself, but for something else. His hand, skeletal and spotted with age, fumbled beneath his pillow. He pulled out something small and dark, its metal surface cold even from a distance. With a surge of effort that cost him dearly, he pushed himself up slightly, his breath catching in a wet sob. "Olivia," he whispered, his voice cracking. He reached for her hand, his fingers a cage of cold bones around hers. He didn't look at her with the eyes of a penitent monster. He looked at her with the pleading gaze of a terrified child. He pressed the object into her palm. A small old key. It was ornate, made of brass, tarnished with age. It felt heavy, a dead weight of secrets. Olivia stared at it, her mind a blank slate of confusion. This was not the confession she had braced herself for. "In the desk," he choked out, each word a painful stone dredged from his failing lungs. "My desk. The bottom drawer. He sagged back against the pillows, his energy spent. Olivia looked from the key to his face, her carefully constructed expectations crumbling into dust. What was this? Some last-minute financial settlement? A hidden token to assuage a lifetime of neglect? His eyes found hers again, and the words that came next undid her completely. They were not words of confession. They were words of misdirection. A final, cryptic testament that twisted the knife of her lifelong torment in a new and impossible direction. "Forgive her," Jacob whispered, his breath a ghost against her skin. "Forgive Eleanor." Olivia's blood ran cold. Her? Forgive her? The architect of her shame, the warden of her prison, the woman who had slapped the truth from her face and replaced it with a lie about a stranger in the night. She thought. He struggled, his grip on her hand tightening with a final desperate strength. It was the only way. To save us. And then his grip slackened. The light in his eyes dimmed, the shallow tide of his breath receded for the last time, and Jacob was gone. He left behind not clarity, not peace, not the cleansing fire of a confession, but a cold brass key and an impossible, poisonous riddle. He had died not by admitting his sin, but by pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at his own saintly wife, leaving Olivia utterly alone in a darkness far deeper and more confusing than any she had known before. The silence he left in his wake was no longer empty. It was screaming with questions. The days that followed Jacob's death were a blur of muted colors and muffled sounds. The funeral was a testament to the lie he and Eleanor had so carefully curated. The church was full, the air thick with the scent of lilies and sanctimonious grief. The new pastor, a young man with earnest eyes who had replaced the one who had known them for decades, spoke of Deacon Miller's quiet strength, his unwavering faith, his pillar of the community status. People patted Olivia's arm, offering condolences for the father she never really had, their faces etched with a pity that felt like acid on her skin. Through it all, Eleanor stood stoic and noble in her grief, a perfect portrait of the grieving widow, accepting sympathies with a grace that made Olivia's stomach churn. Olivia moved through the motions, a ghost at her own father's funeral. The small, cold key was a constant weight in the pocket of her black dress. It was a physical anchor to the chaos that now raged inside her. Forgive her. She thought it was the only way to save us. The words looped in her mind, a venomous mantra. What had Eleanor done that required forgiveness? What had she saved them from? The truth. After the last of the mourners had left their house, leaving behind half-eaten casseroles and the lingering scent of polite sorrow, Olivia found herself standing before the forbidden sanctuary, her father's study. It was a room she had rarely entered. It smelled of old paper, leather, and the faint, sweet aroma of the pipe tobacco he had given up years ago, but which still clung to the heavy velvet curtains. It was a room of masculine silence, the epicenter of the authority that had governed her life. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the heavy oak desk. It was his throne, polished to a high gleam. It was neat, orderly, a reflection of the man the world thought he was. She ran her fingers over the cool, smooth wood before kneeling. The bottom right drawer. It was locked, just as he'd implied. Her hand trembled as she pulled the brass key from her pocket. It felt ancient, imbued with a power she couldn't comprehend. For a moment, she hesitated. Part of her, the part that had been trained for a lifetime to obey and endure, screamed at her to stop, to leave the past buried, to let the dead rest. But another part, a part that had been starved and silenced for over 60 years, demanded to know. It was the part of her that still remembered the girl she was before the night of the attack. The girl who dreamed of a life beyond the suffocating piety of Willow Creek. With a deep, shuddering breath, she inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a soft, grating click that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. She pulled the drawer open. Inside, there was no money, no hidden deed, no legal document. There was only a small, heavy wooden box, inlaid with mother of pearl. It wasn't her father's style at all. It was feminine, ornate. It was something that belonged to Eleanor. Olivia lifted it out. It was unlocked. With a sense of impending doom, she lifted the lid. The contents were not what she expected. A stack of old, leather-bound diaries, tied together with a faded silk ribbon. The leather was worn smooth in places, the kind of wear that comes from decades of being held, opened, and written in. And on the cover of the topmost diary, in faded gold leaf, was a single elegant initial, E, Eleanor's. A wave of nausea washed over Olivia. These were her mother's private thoughts, her confessions, her prayers. This felt like a violation far deeper than opening a locked drawer, but Jacob's dying words propelled her forward. Forgive her. He had sent her here. He wanted her to read this. Her hands shook so badly she could barely untie the ribbon. She opened the first diary, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. The date on the first page sent a jolt through her. It was from the year it happened, the year she turned 16. She began to read, her eyes scanning the neat, controlled cursive that was as familiar to her as her own reflection. At first, the entries were what she expected. Pious reflections on scripture, complaints about the moral decay of the town, notes on church business, and frequent anxious prayers for Olivia's willful spirit. Eleanor worried about her daughter's interest in popular music, her friendships with girls Eleanor deemed unsuitable, her quiet daydreams. To her mother, every normal teenage impulse was a step toward perdition. Olivia's fingers turned the pages, a cold dread coiling in her gut. She was moving closer to the date, the night that had cleaved her life in two. She found the entry for the day after the attack. She steeled herself, expecting to read of a mother's shock, her fear, perhaps even her anger at the stranger who had violated her home and her daughter. But the words on the page were not words of horror. They were words of a chilling, terrifying clarity. October 14th. It has happened. The trial I have prayed for, the test of our faith, has been delivered unto our house. Last night, Jacob came to me, his soul in torment. He confessed his weakness, the sin he committed against his own flesh and blood. He fell upon his knees, a broken man, expecting my condemnation. He did not understand. He did not see the terrible, magnificent hand of God in this moment. Olivia stopped breathing. The room seemed to tilt, the words on the page blurring into an incomprehensible script. Jacob came to me. He confessed. Her mother had known. From the very beginning, she had known. It wasn't a stranger. It was him. And she had known. With a trembling hand, she forced herself to read on. The true horror was not in the confirmation of her attacker's identity. The true horror was in her mother's reaction. My first impulse, I confess, was the weakness of the flesh, a flash of worldly anger, but then the Holy Spirit filled me. I saw the path laid out before us. This was not a random act of evil. This was a divine crucible, designed to purify us, to burn away the dross of pride and sin. Jacob's soul hangs in the balance. The reputation of our family, the sanctity of this house of God, is at stake. To expose him would be to surrender to Satan. It would destroy him, our family, his work in the church. It would be a victory for the world, not for God. No, we must not fail this test. We must bear this burden with faith. I have devised the only path forward, the path of salvation. Olivia's mind reeled. It wasn't a cover-up born of shame or fear in the conventional sense. It was a mission, a holy crusade. In her mother's twisted, fanatical mind, the abuse was not the tragedy. It was the opportunity. She frantically flipped through the pages, her horror mounting with every entry. The diaries laid it all out in cold, meticulous detail, the invention of the stranger. Eleanor described how she had crafted the narrative, carefully selecting details, the smell of the night air, the roughness of the voice, and coaching a traumatized 16-year-old Olivia on what to remember, what to say, what to believe. She had seen her daughter's fractured, dissociative state not as a wound to be healed, but as a canvas on which to paint her righteous lie. October 16th. Olivia is pliable. The shock has made her mind like clay. I told her of the stranger, a a transient, a faceless evil that came from the darkness. I told her this was God's punishment for her vanity, for the sinful thoughts I knew she harbored. She wept. She believed me. It is a necessary cruelty, a surgeon's cut to save the limb. Her small, worldly suffering is a worthy sacrifice for the salvation of her father's eternal soul. The book fell from Olivia's hands, landing with a soft thud on the carpet. A dry, ragged sob escaped her throat. It wasn't a sound of grief. It was a sound of utter annihilation. Her entire life, her entire identity, had been a fiction written by her own mother. The shame she had carried, the guilt that had been her constant companion, the belief that she was inherently flawed and sinful. It was all a deliberate, calculated construction. Eleanor had not been a misguided, overly strict mother trying to protect her. She had been the architect of a lifelong psychological torture, the warden of a prison she herself had built, brick by brick, lie by lie. The secret was not that her father was a monster. The secret was that her mother was a far greater one, a monster who believed she was a saint. She hadn't been protecting Jacob from the world. She had been saving his soul by sacrificing her daughters. Olivia was not a victim in her mother's story. She was a tool, an instrument in a deranged act of faith, and she had spent a lifetime believing she deserved it. The years following Jacob's death were the strangest of Olivia's life. She now possessed a truth more terrible than any lie she had ever been told, a knowledge that burned like a radioactive core within her. Yet she said nothing. What was there to say? How could she confront a woman who would see the accusation not as a revelation of her cruelty, but as a sign of Olivia's spiritual failure? To Eleanor, the diaries were not an indictment. They were a testament to her faith, a record of her righteous sacrifice. To reveal them would be to play a game she could never win, using rules her mother had invented. So, Olivia lived with the soul-destroying knowledge. She remained in the house on Willow Creek, a silent observer in her own life. She watched Eleanor age, her piety growing more pronounced, more performative with each passing year. She watched her mother pray over meals, her eyes closed in beatific serenity, and saw not a woman communing with God, but a monster admiring her own handiwork. Every kind word from Eleanor, every gesture of maternal concern, was now laced with a poison that Olivia could taste. The house, once a prison of oppressive rules, was now a mausoleum, haunted by the ghost of a truth only Olivia knew. Her relationship with Samuel was her only solace, yet even that was tainted. Samuel, now a grown man, was kind and dutiful. He loved Olivia with the uncomplicated affection of a younger brother for his older sister. He saw her as the quiet, long-suffering victim of their mother's inexplicable harshness, and he often defended her in small ways, earning him Eleanor's sharp rebukes. But he did not know the truth. He did not know that the woman he called his sister was his mother, and the woman he called his mother was his jailer. How could Olivia tell him? How could she detonate a bomb that would obliterate his entire understanding of his life, his family, his very identity? The secret, now hers to keep, was a wall between them, a pane of thick, soundproof glass. Eleanor died on a Tuesday, in her sleep, sanctimonious to the very end. The town mourned the passing of a saint. The church eulogized her as a pillar of faith, a woman of unwavering moral conviction. Olivia sat through a second funeral in the same pew, listening to a second set of lies about a parent who was a monster. But this time, there was no confusion, only a cold, hard clarity. She felt nothing but a profound, hollow emptiness. The warden was dead, but the prison walls were still standing. A week later, they gathered in the sterile, mahogany-paneled office of a lawyer named Mr. Gable. The air was thick with the scent of lemon polish and old paper. Present were Olivia, Samuel, and the same earnest young pastor who had presided over both funerals. Samuel sat beside Olivia, his expression somber and respectful. He placed a comforting hand on her arm, a gesture of solidarity against whatever final pronouncements their difficult mother had left behind. Mr. Gable, a man with a professionally somber face, cleared his throat and adjusted his spectacles. He began to read Eleanor's last will and testament in a dry, dispassionate monotone. The legal jargon washed over Olivia, phrases about assets, accounts, property. The family home and the considerable estate were to be divided. A significant portion was bequeathed to the church, a final, public performance of her piety. Olivia expected nothing for herself and felt no sting at its absence. But then, Mr. Gable paused. He looked up over his spectacles, first at Samuel, then with a flicker of something akin to discomfort at Olivia. The air in the room grew heavy. "The remainder of the estate," he continued, his voice carefully neutral, "including all properties, investments, and personal effects, is bequeathed in its entirety to my beloved son, Samuel Miller." Samuel shifted uncomfortably, a flush rising on his neck. He had never been beloved. He had been a project, a soul to be molded and saved from the supposed taint of his origins. "However," Mr. Gable said, and the word hung in the air like a guillotine, "this bequest comes with a single, binding condition." He took a slow, deliberate breath before reading the next clause. The words were Eleanor's, but they were delivered with the cold, impersonal finality of law. "My son Samuel shall receive this inheritance only upon the condition that he publicly and formally severs any and all ties with his sister, Olivia Miller. He must, in a letter submitted to the pastor and the church elders, renounce his relationship with her, acknowledging her status as a morally corrupting influence and an unrepentant sinner, as her life of defiance has proven her to be. Should he refuse to meet this condition, the entirety of his inheritance shall be forfeited and absorbed into the donation to the church." Silence. It was a profound, absolute silence that consumed all the air in the room. The hum of the air conditioning, the distant sound of traffic, the ticking of the clock on the wall, all of it vanished. There was only the echo of Eleanor's venomous words. It was her masterpiece. A final, exquisitely cruel act of control from beyond the grave. It was not enough to have tortured Olivia for her entire life. It was not enough to have stolen her son, her identity, her very past. With her last breath, Eleanor had devised a way to take her future too. She had crafted a public stage for Olivia's ultimate humiliation and isolation. She was forcing Samuel to choose financial security and a place in the community, or the sister who had been his only consistent source of gentle affection. She was trying to kill their love, to poison it with pragmatism and shame. Olivia didn't look at the lawyer or the pastor, whose face was a mask of shock and embarrassment. She looked at Samuel. She saw the blood drain from his face, his expression a chaotic mixture of disbelief, horror, and a dawning, sickening comprehension. He stared at the will as if it were a coiled snake on the polished table. Eleanor had finally made her endgame clear. She wanted to erase Olivia completely, and in her breathtaking arrogance, she had handed Olivia the one thing she had never possessed before, a public stage and a reason to finally speak the truth. The ghost of her mother was attempting one last act of tyranny, but in doing so, she had just unlocked the door to her own tomb. The air in Mr. Henderson's office was a preserved specimen of time, thick with the scent of aging paper, lemon polish, and the faint, sweet decay of leather-bound books that had not been opened in a generation. Dust motes danced in the slanted afternoon light, each one a tiny, silent witness to the proceedings. Olivia sat perfectly still on the stiff horsehair chair, her back straight, her hands folded in the lap of her simple black dress. She felt the gaze of the room on her, the lawyer's professionally sympathetic stare, the pastor's blandly pious concern, and Samuel's confused, pained watchfulness. Each look was a tiny weight, but after a lifetime of carrying a mountain, they were nothing. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the hushed space. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the document, the last will and testament of Eleanor Grace Albright. "And to my grandson, Samuel Albright," he read, his voice a dry rustle of parchment, "I bequeath the entirety of my remaining estate, including the family home at 14 Willow Creek Lane and all associated financial assets, on one condition: a collective intake of breath." Olivia felt Samuel stiffen beside her. A condition. Of course, there was a condition. Eleanor's love, like her faith, had always been transactional. The lawyer continued, his tone betraying a hint of discomfort. "The condition is as follows: that Samuel Albright, within 30 days of this reading, must publicly and legally disavow any and all familial connection to his sister, Olivia Albright, citing her history of moral failings and her corrupting influence. He is to have no further contact with her for the good of his own soul and in honor of the righteous life his grandparents endeavored to provide him. A stunned, suffocating silence descended. It was more than a silence. It was a vacuum, pulling the air from the room. The pastor, a man named Michael who had known Eleanor only in her sainted final years, shifted uncomfortably, his face a mask of placid bewilderment. Samuel was pale, his knuckles white where he gripped the arms of his chair. A muscle worked in his jaw, his expression a storm of shock, disgust, and raw, untethered anger. He looked at Olivia, his eyes wide with a plea and a promise to refuse, to shout, to tear the damnable document to shreds. Before he could utter a word, a quiet, almost imperceptible movement drew every eye. Olivia was rising. She did not struggle. She did not use the arms of the chair for support. She rose with a slow, deliberate grace, a preternatural calm settling over her 80-year-old features like a fine layer of dust. The lines on her face, carved by decades of silent suffering, seemed less like scars of sorrow and more like a map of profound, unshakable resolve. Her eyes, which for so long had been cast downward in practiced submission, were now fixed directly on Samuel. They were clear, steady, and held a depth of knowledge that made the very air in the room feel thin. Her voice, when it came, was not the frail, reedy tone of an old woman. It was measured, resonant, and carried the weight of an entire lifetime. That will be impossible. The words hung in the air, simple, absolute. Mr. Henderson blinked, looking from the will to Olivia as if she were a misprint. Pastor Michael opened his mouth, then closed it again. Olivia held Samuel's gaze. He cannot disown his sister. She paused, letting the statement settle, letting the implication land in the fertile ground of their confusion. Then, with the precision of a surgeon making the final life-altering incision, she delivered the blow that would shatter their world. Because I am his mother. The silence that followed was different. It was not a vacuum. It was a solid thing, a wall of glass crashing down around them. Samuel's face went slack, the anger draining away to be replaced by a vast, uncomprehending void. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. He looked at the woman he had known his entire life as his quiet, long-suffering older sister, and tried to see a mother. The lawyer was the first to find his professional footing, however unsteady. Mrs. Albright. Olivia, he corrected himself, his tone laced with a gentle condescension reserved for the grieving and the confused. The shock of your mother's passing, coupled with the unusual nature of her will, can be very disorienting. Perhaps we should take a short break. Pastor Michael nodded eagerly. Yes, a moment of quiet reflection. Let us not speak in haste. Grief can cloud the mind. But Olivia was not grieving. She was liberated. She turned her steady gaze from her son to the two men who represented the pillars of the community that had buried her alive. There is no cloud, she said, her voice unwavering. There is only the truth, which has been hidden by a storm for far too long. And then she began to speak. Not in a torrent of emotion, but with the clear, unadorned cadence of someone reciting a history they have memorized in the dark, night after night, for more than 60 years. She spoke of a 16-year-old girl who loved the smell of rain on dry earth and the feel of sunshine on her face. She spoke of a home ruled not by love, but by a terrifying, suffocating piety. She spoke of a night when the familiar scent of her father's pipe tobacco was no longer a comfort, but a harbinger of a violation that stole her youth. She spoke of turning to her mother, Eleanor, for solace, and receiving a slap and a sermon instead. She recounted, word for word, the lie Eleanor had woven, the story of a nameless, faceless stranger, a punishment from God for a sinful nature Olivia never possessed. She laid out the truth of her pregnancy, the secret shame that had been her constant companion. She described the family council, Eleanor presiding, Jacob silent and spectral, where it was decided that to protect the family's good name, to protect the deacon's reputation, the baby would be born in secret and raised as her younger brother. She spoke of the theft of her identity, the moment she ceased to be Olivia and became a living penance, a cautionary tale whispered in the hallowed halls of their home. Her voice never broke. Her hands did not tremble. She was not asking for pity or for belief. She was simply stating facts, laying one brick of truth upon another, building a new reality in the sterile light of the lawyer's office. Samuel sat frozen, his world deconstructing with every syllable she uttered. Memories, once simple, now refracted into 1,000 painful new meanings. Olivia's furtive bedtime stories, the way she would mend his clothes with a tenderness that felt deeper than a sister's. Eleanor's inexplicable cruelty towards her own daughter, a bitterness that had always seemed so out of place in a saint. He remembered, with a sudden gut-wrenching clarity, a time when he was 10 years old. He'd found Olivia weeping silently in the pantry, and when Eleanor had discovered them and raised her hand to strike, he had thrown himself in front of Olivia, shouting, "Leave her alone!" He had been punished alongside her, sent to his room without supper, but Olivia had later snuck him a piece of bread and jam, her touch on his hair a fleeting moment of pure, undiluted love. He had thought it was the fierce love of a protective sister. Now he felt the staggering, world-altering weight of what it truly was. The lie, the monstrous, life-defining lie, was finally, horribly slain. The pastor cleared his throat, his face a mottled pink. He looked at Olivia not with compassion, but with a kind of clinical horror, as if she were a parishioner who had confessed to a heresy too profound to comprehend. "Olivia, my dear," he began, his voice oozing a practiced, patronizing sympathy. These are terrible, terrible accusations. To speak this way of your parents, your blessed mother, on the day of her will," he trailed off, shaking his head slowly. "A woman of such unimpeachable faith, a pillar of our community." Mr. Henderson, ever the pragmatist, chimed in, his gaze sharp and skeptical. "Olivia, with all due respect, what you're describing is a lifetime of deception. Without any form of proof, it is just a story. A very painful story, to be sure, but one that directly contradicts everything we know about Eleanor and Jacob Albright." Samuel was still frozen, a statue carved from shock. His mind was a maelstrom, trying to reconcile the mother he was told he had, a sainted, benevolent matriarch, with the monster Olivia was describing. He wanted to believe Olivia. Every strange, disjointed memory of his childhood suddenly clicked into place, forming a dark, terrifying mosaic, but the conditioning of a lifetime was a powerful anesthetic. Eleanor? A liar? A tormentor? The thought felt like a physical impossibility, a violation of the laws of nature as he knew them. This was the moment Olivia had anticipated, the wall of disbelief, the rationalizations, the defense of the saint. She had known her word alone would not be enough to tear down a fortress built over 60 years. With the same unnerving calm, she reached down into the simple cloth bag at her feet. Her hand emerged holding not one, but 3 small, leather-bound books, their covers worn smooth with time, their spines cracked. They were Eleanor's diaries. She placed them on the polished surface of the lawyer's mahogany desk. The sound they made was soft, but it echoed in the silence, like a judge's gavel. "You want proof, Mr. Henderson?" Olivia's voice was quiet, but it cut through the room's thick skepticism. Eleanor was meticulous. She chronicled everything. She called it her dialogue with God. She opened the first diary, its pages yellowed and brittle. The spidery, slanted script of her mother's hand filled every page. Samuel stared at the books as if they were venomous snakes. He had seen his grandmother writing in them countless times, her expression one of pious contemplation. Olivia did not need to search for the passages. She knew their location by heart, had burned them into her memory in the dark, lonely hours after her father's death. She did not turn to the pages that might have detailed the night of her assault. To read those would be to relive her own violation, to give them a spectacle. Her strategy was far more devastating. She would not expose her wound. She would expose the one who had salted it for a lifetime. She began to read, her voice a dispassionate narrator of a conspiracy. October 12th, she read from a page dated decades ago. "The devil has found a foothold in this house. A great sin has been committed. My Jacob, my poor, weak Jacob, has fallen. But the Lord does not give us burdens we cannot bear. This is a test, a crucible to burn away the sin and purify his soul. The girl, Olivia, was the vessel of this temptation. Her worldly nature was the kindling for this fire. The pastor's face went from pink to a stark, waxy white. Olivia turned a few pages, her finger tracing the faded ink. November 3rd. The girl's shame has borne fruit. A child. This cannot stand. It would be the ruin of us, the end of Jacob's ministry. The Lord has given me clarity, a plan. We will say she was accosted by a stranger on the road. We will make her understand that this is her penance, her path back to grace. The child will be raised under this roof, a constant reminder of the wages of sin, but he will be called her brother. He will be my grandson. I will raise him in righteousness, and through his purity, we will cleanse this family's stain. She looked up, her gaze sweeping over the stunned faces of the lawyer and the pastor. "And this," she said, her voice dropping to an almost whisper as she found the final damning entry. "This was written on Samuel's 10th birthday." She read, "The boy has a good heart, but it is too soft, too easily swayed by his sister's melancholy. I must be vigilant. I have sacrificed Olivia's worldly happiness for this family's eternal salvation. It is a mother's heaviest burden to prune a tainted branch so the tree may live. May God forgive me for the necessity of my cruelty, and may He see the purity of my intention." The words fell into the silent room like stones into a deep well. The carefully constructed facade of St. Eleanor, the pious widow, the community pillar, did not just crack. It vaporized. It turned to ash and blew away on the winds of her own meticulously documented deceit. The woman they had eulogized just days before was not a saint. She was a masterful, cold-blooded architect of psychological torture, a religious fanatic who had cannibalized her own daughter's life to preserve a lie. The spell over Samuel finally broke. It wasn't a shout of rage that escaped him, but a choked, ragged sob. He saw it all now. The years of stolen love, the endless, undeserved punishments, the invisible cage he had never even known he was in. He looked at Olivia, truly looked at her for the first time, at the frail, stooped shoulders that had carried an impossible burden, at the hands that had secretly soothed his fevers, at the eyes that had watched him grow up with a love she was never allowed to name. He stumbled from his chair, crossing the room in 2 long strides. He didn't know what to say. There were no words for a grief this large, for a lifetime stolen, so he did the only thing he could. He wrapped his arms around his mother, burying his face in her shoulder, and he wept. He wept for the 16-year-old girl she had been. He wept for the lost boy he had been. He wept for the 60 years of silence, and for the mother and son they were only now, in the ruins of it all, allowed to become. The first winter after Eleanor's death felt like a continuation of the old life, a long, gray exhalation of breath. The legal battle to contest the will was a grim, sordid affair, but Eleanor's own diaries were an irrefutable testament to her manipulations, and the law, for once, sided with the truth. The oppressive family home in Willow Creek, with its shadowed corners and air thick with unspoken cruelties, was sold to a developer who planned to tear it down. Olivia and Samuel watched the for sale sign go up, not with triumph, but with a quiet, mutual sense of release, as if they were closing the cover on a long and difficult book. They packed only what mattered: old photographs, a handful of books, the small chipped teacup Olivia had favored. The rest, the heavy dark furniture, the pious accusing portraits, the very dust of the place, they left behind to be purged. The seasons turned, pulling them away from the wreckage of their past. They moved west, chasing a sun that felt gentler, a horizon that felt wider. They found a small, unassuming house in a quiet coastal town in Oregon, a place where the air tasted of salt and pine, and the most dramatic event of the day was the tide pulling away from the shore. No one knew them here. They were not the son of St. Eleanor or the disgraced sister. They were simply Olivia and Samuel, a quiet woman and her devoted son, their shared history, a silent, invisible thread that bound them. A year can be a lifetime. On a bright, breezy afternoon, with the sun casting a warm, honeyed glow over everything. Olivia was in her garden. It wasn't a large garden, just a small, vibrant patch of earth behind their cottage, but it was hers. She had tilled the soil with her own hands, enriching the dark, sandy loam, feeling the life in it. She had planted lavender and rosemary, their scents a constant, soothing presence on the sea air. She had planted rows of bright, cheerful zinnias and cosmos that danced in the wind, and fat, heavy-headed sunflowers that followed the light across the sky. Her hands, once perpetually folded in her lap in a gesture of submission, were now dusted with soil, her nails permanently underlined with dirt. She moved slowly, methodically, her back no longer ramrod straight with tension, but curved in the gentle, purposeful arc of her work. Samuel came out of the back door, carrying 2 mugs of tea. He moved with a quietness that had become their language. The grand speeches and tearful confessions were long past. Their bond had settled into something deeper, a peaceful rhythm of shared days. He handed her a mug, his fingers brushing against hers. "The tide's coming in," he said, his voice as calm as the distant surf. Olivia nodded, taking a slow sip of the hot tea. She looked out past her riot of flowers, towards the shimmering line of the Pacific. She saw the gulls wheeling overhead, their cries sharp and free. There were no ghosts here. The oppressive weight of her parents' judgment, the constant echo of her mother's voice pronouncing her a sinner, had finally faded. They were just memories now, brittle and distant, like pressed flowers from a life that belonged to someone else. She looked at Samuel. The lines of grief and shock that had been carved so deeply into his face a year ago had softened. He smiled at her, a real easy smile that reached his eyes. In that moment, she felt a surge of love so pure and profound it was almost breathtaking. It was a love that had survived 60 years in the dark, a seed that had refused to die and was now, finally, allowed to bloom in the sunlight. They had not sought vengeance. They had not received an apology, but they had something far more precious. Olivia looked up at the vast blue sky, her face relaxed, her eyes clear. She had survived her tormentors. She had outlived their lies. And here, in this small garden by the sea, surrounded by the scent of salt and flowers, she had reclaimed the one thing they could never truly take from her, her identity as a mother, and her boundless, resilient capacity to love. The story was over. Hers was just beginning.